Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Shirley Tong, and I'm the director of the graduate track in literature and also the coordinator of this event. On behalf of the literature track at Kansas State University, and the English department at Kansas State University, I want to thank you all for coming to #Shakespeare After Shakespeare. In the spirit of Laurie Gunderson's play, The Book of Will, which dramatizes how the Shakespeare we all know and love today was brought to life by the otherwise unacknowledged efforts of his friends, I wanted to begin by thanking the unseen hands that made this event possible. First of all, a big thank you goes to Chuck Leonard, the director of the show, who has been involved with and collaborating on this night since its inception back in November. Many thanks also goes to the Manhattan Arts Center and its tireless staff, especially Michelle Ward, who, in addition to fielding my several emails and phone calls over the past few weeks, designed our eye-catching flyer. Last but not least, I'm grateful to my colleagues in the department who assisted me at every stage of the planning process. Don Hedrick, Karen Northway, Cecilia Pitt-Gomez, Karen Westman, and Naomi Wood. Since, in the words of Shakespeare, brevity is the soul of wit, I will end this preamble here to present our first speaker. It gives me much pleasure to introduce Michael Donnelly, who has been summoned out of retirement for this event. Michael Donnelly, sorry. I will allow Michael to take his applause first. Michael Donnelly taught in the English department at K-State for 45 years before retiring in May of 2017. Specializing in Milton and 17th century literature, he also cultivated an enjoyable sideline, teaching introduction to Shakespeare throughout that period. He also enjoyed teaching Restoration 18th century literature, or 18th century drama rather, for several years, another genre he has never officially studied. He enjoyed teaching Shakespeare because, like Bottom, he aspired to do all the parts. He has performed Malvolio from Twelfth Night and Leontes from The Winter Tale at the MAC, and Polonius in a K-State production of Hamlet. His talk today is titled Traducing Shakespeare, How Every Age Makes the Bard Their Own. I present to you Michael Donnelly.
Shakespeare's plays, sorry about that. There we are. Now, I always forget this until I see people coming out of the store with one on. Shakespeare's plays have been a mainstay of the theatrical repertoire since the theaters reopened after the Restoration in 1660, but they've never attained the status of Holy Writ. Each new age paid its homage by adapting, cutting, adding to, jiggering in various ways his plots, his characters, and especially his language, thus suiting them to the tastes of its audiences and the critical canons of its time. In the later 17th century, a rigid regime of neoclassical critical principles and class-based social decorum resulted in an artificial and attenuated range of human emotion and action being represented on the stage, especially in serious plays, with persistent simplification of language in the name of correctness. Shakespeare's plays held the stage throughout the later 17th century and into the 18th, but they did so in improved versions. Some of the critical principles guiding Restoration improvers of Shakespeare are projected on the screen behind me. John Dryden, the dominant literary figure of the later Restoration period, poet laureate and preeminent in his age in practically every genre, lays down critical principles in numerous prefaces to his various works, justifying his practices in adapting Shakespeare's plays. His principles asserted as standards propriety and correctness in the language of the play, suiting language and behavior to the status of the character. While reverencing Shakespeare, he qualifies his praise, and I will quote, "His whole style is so pestered with figurative expressions that it is as affected as it is obscure. The fury of his fancy often transported him beyond the bounds of judgment, either in coining of new words and phrases or racking words which were in use. Fancy must be regulated if it is to be capable of producing a reasonable and judicious poem. Dryden's most successful adaptation of Shakespeare is his version of Antony and Cleopatra, All for Love, or The World Well Lost. Even here, his insistence on refinement, decorum, and correctness leads him to sacrifice, on grounds of social or literary convention, real instances of Shakespeare's powerful evocation of a range of human emotions. On neoclassical grounds that comedy and tragedy should on no account appear in the same play and be mixed, Dryden will omit from All for Love the comic character and his banter, the clown who brings to Cleopatra for her intended suicide after Antony's death, the pretty worm of Nilus there that kills and pains not. Cleopatra's resolve to die is presented thus in Dryden. Challenged by Charmian, one of her attendants, "Remember, madam, he charged you not to grieve." Cleopatra replies, "And I'll obey him. I have not loved a Roman not to know what should become his wife. His wife, my Charmian, for 'tis to that high title I aspire. And now I'll not die less. Let dull Octavia survive to mourn him dead. My nobler fate shall knit our spousals with a tie too strong for Roman laws to break." Even the best thing in this, the spousal claim, is in fact transferred from Antony and Cleopatra. As in Shakespeare, Cleopatra elaborately stages her death scene. "Give me my robe, put on my crown, I have immortal longings in me. Now no more the juice of Egypt's grape shall moist this lip. Yare, yare, good Eros, quick. Methinks I hear Antony call. I see him rouse himself to praise my noble act. I hear him mock the luck of Caesar, which the gods give men to excuse their after wrath. Husband, I come. Now to that name, my courage prove my title. I am fire and air, my other elements I give to baser life." Dryden's words lack the heightened resonance of Shakespeare's. He also smooths the complexity of motive Shakespeare embeds in Cleopatra's last utterances. Dryden's Cleopatra thinks only of a Roman death, proving her nobility and right to Antony's love, triumphing over Antony's Roman wife, Octavia. Shakespeare mixes that aspiration, expressed in high metaphor, with Cleopatra's own sense of triumph over the super-politic Octavius Caesar. "Oh, couldst thou speak," she says to the asp, "that I might hear thee call great Caesar ass, unpolicied." Dryden aims to simplify motive and focus on a narrow range of high locutions, while Shakespeare embraces a more realistic reflection of the rapid fluctuations of human thought and the complexity of motive behind so many of our actions, embedded in a register that spans high style and colloquial address. In Shakespeare, when Cleopatra faints over the dead Antony, her attendants frantically try to revive her, calling out, "Oh, madam, madam, madam," and "Royal Egypt, Empress," to which Cleopatra, reviving, replies, "No more, but e'en a woman, and commanded by such poor passion as the maid that milks and does the meanest chores." Dryden's principle that a great queen should not compare herself to a milkmaid erases from his play one of the most human and touching expressions of Cleopatra's devastation at the loss of Antony. Dryden's All for Love is easily one of the best Restoration series plays. In fact, it might hold the stage successfully today, so long as memories of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra were sufficiently remote. It's easy to condescend to the travesties visited upon Shakespeare's dramatic and linguistic imagination by Restoration social and critical shibboleths, but Restoration adapters were acceding to tastes and expectations of theater audiences of their own day, submitting to rational seeming but artificial critical conventions that had cultural prestige at the time. In doing so, they were only doing what directors and performers today, in their turn, do all the time. When Shakespeare rewrote the old play about the legendary King Lear, the conventional ideas of his age would have held favorable views of patriarchy, monarchy, the wisdom of old age and the respect due to it, and the obedience owed by children to their parents. Without putting too fine a point on it, it might be said that today, none of these beliefs command much respect, at least among people who go to the theater. Consequently, throughout its stage history until late in the last century, Shakespeare's king, more sinned against than sinning, would have commanded respect and pity, while the machinations of Edmund, Goneril, and Regan would have been doubly shocking. And Cordelia, the paragon of unbending virtue, would have been seen as a center of value in the play's moral universe. When Peter Brook directed A King Lear in the 1960s, of which it may be said that it was a play about a violent, senile old man who had two daughters at least, for whom there was much to be said, and a third likely to be found unreal or incomprehensible, that production was no less an appeal to the tastes and contexts of the time. Every age adapts the bard to suit its dominant concerns, its reigning literary conventions, its desire to make relevant, or at least make it new. So Brooke's version, King Lear becomes a theater of cruelty or theater of the absurd. So manifold are the resources of the original texts that in every age, Shakespeare's works invite revisiting and tinkering to dress them up to flatter our expectations. And so extraordinarily rich are those works, they survive the process, which at its best sends us back to ponder the originals again, to marvel at their resiliency, resonance, and multiety, sends us back to reflect on what we have been given by Mr. Hemming and Mr. Condell's, Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, published according to the true original copies.
Thank you, Michael. So our next presenter for tonight is Natalie Lipcat. She's a first-year master's student and expository writing graduate instructor at K-State. She specializes in children's literature and young adult literature with additional focus on comparative literature. Her interest in the English Renaissance drama stems from a fascination with the cultural resonance of Shakespeare's plays. Her talk today is titled Star-Crossed Lovers and Social Strife, Shakespearean Influences in American Adolescent Literature.
Could you give me the screen sharing? Sorry, just having a little
Just a moment, please.
difficulties trying to simultaneously do Zoom and a presentation.
I think most people can sympathize with hybrid teaching.
There you go. Thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction. So the title of my presentation is Star-Crossed Lovers and Social Strife, Shakespearean Influences in American Adolescent Literature. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. These lines from the prologue of Shakespeare's tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, are the source of a phrase that is used to describe a fated romantic pairing. Star-crossed is sometimes interpreted as a way to refer to a couple that is destined to be together, but usually means a union between lovers that is doomed to end in tragedy. This phrase is one of the many varying ways that Shakespeare's works resonate in modern culture, from our literature to our language. Today, I will be discussing the origins and subsequent influence of Romeo and Juliet, and the way in which young adult authors have been inspired by Shakespeare's tale of ill-fated love. The literary tradition of tragic romance can be traced back to antiquity. Shakespeare is known to have been inspired by Pyramus and Thisbe, written in 8 AD by the Roman poet Ovid. Pyramus and Thisbe is part of the epic narrative poem Metamorphoses, and tells the story of two young lovers separated by their families. Shakespeare enthusiasts might also recognize this particular play from its meta-theatrical inclusion in A Midsummer Night's Dream. In addition to classical tradition, Shakespeare also drew on earlier Italian literature as he wrote Romeo and Juliet. The Capulets and Montagues, two rival families who form the central conflict in Romeo and Juliet, were first mentioned in Dante's Divine Comedy as warring factions from northern Italy. The translation of Italian short novels ultimately became the chief source for Shakespeare's play. Despite the existing tradition of romantic tragedy, Romeo and Juliet is by far the most enduring work within this literary genre. Today, Romeo and Juliet is familiar to cultures all across the world, and the titular characters have become the most well-known archetype of young lovers. This play was hardly obscure during Shakespeare's lifetime either. Romeo and Juliet came out in 4 editions before the first folio that collected the Bard's plays. The many reprints of Romeo and Juliet are testament to the popularity of this tragedy among Renaissance audiences. And in the 400-odd years since it was first staged, Shakespeare's play has been retold in a multitude of ways. In addition to the wide variety of stage adaptations, Romeo and Juliet is one of, if not the most filmed play of all time. Some of these screen adaptations, like Baz Luhrmann's 1996 film, have made their own cultural impact. So what makes Shakespeare's works so compelling that they have been retold for hundreds of years? This is a question that all of you here can contemplate. But meanwhile, I'd like to provide some insight on how young adult authors have been inspired by Shakespearean archetypes of tragic love. Young adult literature, abbreviated as YA literature, is also sometimes called adolescent or teen fiction. While English Renaissance theater goes back to the 1500s and 1600s, YA was only accepted as a literary genre in the 1960s and popularized in the 70s. Despite its relatively recent emergence, there has been a consistent growth in the market for young adult fiction. In 2021, YA saw the largest increase in print sales among all book categories. One example of a popular and critically acclaimed work of YA fiction is John Green's 2012 novel, The Fault in Our Stars, which received a film adaptation in 2014. The title of Green's coming-of-age novel quotes one of Shakespeare's historical tragedies and is evidence of the Shakespearean influence that can be discerned in YA fiction. One particularly interesting trend is the link between Romeo and Juliet and American adolescent literature. A variety of late 20th century authors employed themes of tragic romance and destiny to explore social issues that were prevalent in the United States at the time and remain relevant today. Examples of this include Betty Green's 1973 novel, Summer of My German Soldier, and Sharon Draper's direct adaptation, Romeo and Juliet, published in 1999. But the text that I'd like to explore further tonight is If You Come Softly, a novel about love between teenagers from 2 different backgrounds. If You Come Softly was published in 1998 by Jacqueline Woodson, an acclaimed children's and young adult novelist. Woodson was a keynote speaker for the Conference on Children's Literature that took place at K-State in April 2018. In an interview for Publishers Weekly in 2002, 4 years after the publication of If You Come Softly, it was stated that, quote, Woodson's books explore the very issues that tear family and society apart, end quote. Woodson's 1998 novel tells the story of Ellie, a 15-year-old Jewish girl, and Jeremiah, an African-American teenager. While Shakespeare's star-crossed lovers meet at a ball in Verona, Ellie and Jeremiah cross paths at their New York high school and fall in love at first sight. If You Come Softly is noted for its social commentary, as the romance between the main characters speaks to the difficulty of relationships that occur across the boundaries of economic class or separation of culture. But I was also fascinated by the novel's lyrical, almost dreamlike prose. The story is mainly told by Woodson's narrator, Ellie, whose point of view is written as a testament to the beauty of emotion and sensation in first love. While writing If You Come Softly, Woodson realized that, quote, her novel was a modern day Romeo and Juliet, end quote. Like Shakespeare's play, If You Come Softly ends in the sharp impact of tragedy. Just as the young couple plan to introduce each other to their families, Ellie receives sudden news of Jeremiah's death. Jeremiah dies after being shot by law enforcement who mistake his identity. The two final lines of Romeo and Juliet tell us that, for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. But despite Shakespeare's work being characterized as a tragedy, audiences have long been compelled by the play's romance. Today, the names of Romeo and Juliet are, in many different languages, synonymous with love. Like the conclusion of Shakespeare's play, If You Come Softly demonstrates the glimmer of hope that can be found in tragedy. At the end of Romeo and Juliet, two rival families realize the futility of their conflict and reconcile over their mutual grief. If You Come Softly concludes with Ellie looking at photos of herself and Jeremiah, knowing that she will always treasure the memory of the fleeting time that they spent together. Woodson's novel and other young adult literature proves that Romeo and Juliet will continue to be readapted and reimagined as long as there is love. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Our third presenter, Anne-Sophie Tooley, is a second-year master's student in the literature track at Kansas State University. Her primary interests are in English Renaissance literature, and she's especially fascinated with the period's religious history and the changing perceptions of death in Shakespeare's culture. Her talk today, which is titled The Influence of Ecclesiastes on Hamlet's Death Anxieties, explores both of these interests in the context of Shakespeare's Hamlet.
The Book of Will is a play about the creation of the big book of Shakespeare's collected plays called the First Folio. But Shakespeare himself was reading big books. The one I will be talking about today is the Bible. Since at least the 19th century, countless scholars have examined the Bible's influence on Shakespeare's works. And in recent decades, some scholars have argued that Ecclesiastes, one of the Old Testament wisdom books, is an important biblical text that deepens our understanding of Shakespeare's works, especially the unorthodox elements within his plays. If you're unfamiliar with this wisdom book, Ecclesiastes essentially presents itself as the reflections of King Solomon, who is referred to as the preacher, and who meditates on the human condition, including issues of divine justice and the meaning of life in the face of death. Specifically, many parallels exist between Ecclesiastes and Hamlet's meditations on mortality, which suggest that Shakespeare likely turned to this wisdom book for inspiration while writing Hamlet. And yet, Hamlet's engagement with Ecclesiastes' thoughts on death and the afterlife do not reflect the orthodox reading of this biblical text that would have been dominant during Shakespeare's lifetime. For example, if we look at the editor's interpretive notes in the margins of the 1560 edition of the Geneva Bible, which was the most popular Bible in Shakespeare's day, we get a good sense of the culturally orthodox interpretation of this wisdom book. Unsurprisingly, the editors of the Geneva Bible believe Ecclesiastes supports the belief in the soul's immortality and the Christian afterlife. However, Hamlet seems to be pushing against this reading and taps into a more radical, unorthodox reading that destabilizes Protestant Christianity's belief in the afterlife. In my talk today, I will show how Shakespeare the reader adapted his sources, reading the Bible against a grain to challenge his play's audiences. Even though Hamlet's famous to-be speech is not usually perceived as expressing biblical ideas about death, it actually does voice doubts about the afterlife, similar to the preachers in Ecclesiastes. For example, in chapter 3, the preacher calls into question humans' ability to know what happens after death, when he rhetorically questions whether humans and animals have different fates after they die, by asking, "Who knoweth whether the spirit of man ascend upward and the spirit of the beast descend downward to the earth?" However, the Geneva editors assert in the marginal notes that what the preacher doubts here is not necessarily the existence of an afterlife, but reason's ability to understand what happens after death. And they argue instead that faith is what provides certainty in the soul's immortality. And yet, a careful reader of Ecclesiastes will notice that the preacher makes no mention of faith when expressing his doubts about the afterlife. Hamlet's to-be speech echoes the preacher's uncertainties and does not mention anything about faith when it comes to life after death, suggesting Shakespeare's more unorthodox interpretation of this biblical text. Hamlet begins his speech by contemplating the possibility of non-existence after death, but this idea anxiously unravels as the speech progresses, and yet is never entirely rejected. As he contemplates death as a dreamless sleep, his speech is suddenly disrupted by the thought that there may be some form of awareness beyond this life when he states, "To sleep, perchance to dream," and then expands this idea by wondering, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. The words perchance and may to describe the possibility of these dreams occurring does not necessarily deny the previous view of non-existence. Instead, they convey Hamlet's uncertain attitude towards conscious awareness after death. On a similar note, his subsequent description of the realm of the dead as an undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns suggest that the dead may inhabit a place. However, because it remains undiscovered to all mortals, it is impossible to know anything about this realm. Also, even though the word country signifies a place, this realm's existence can neither be confirmed nor denied by the dead, which calls its reality into question. Like the preacher who challenges human knowledge about what happens after death, Hamlet's doubts towards this very issue permeate his speech. By echoing Ecclesiastes' uncertainties about the fate of the self after death, Hamlet participates in an unorthodox reading of this biblical text that does not reflect the interpretation of the Geneva editors, who claim that faith is what provides certainty in the soul's immortality. By acknowledging Ecclesiastes as a source that deeply influenced Hamlet's unorthodox thoughts on death and the afterlife, our larger perception of the play's genre changes. While the play is usually categorized as a revenge tragedy, the similarities between Hamlet and Ecclesiastes helps us understand Hamlet more as a biblical play, which was a popular genre at the turn of the 17th century. The unorthodox influence of Ecclesiastes on Hamlet also makes us see this play as more radical and perhaps more dangerous in the eyes of local authorities, especially considering the doubt it expresses about the Christian afterlife. However, despite the play's unchristian doubts, it still remains biblical in genre by echoing the preacher's own views of death and the afterlife as they're voiced in the Bible. Significantly, if we view Hamlet as a preacher-like figure who preaches to his audience about the profound mystery of death, then it may be argued that Shakespeare was using drama to destabilize his audience's Christian beliefs about the afterlife, to perhaps make them doubt their ability to truly know what happens after death.
Anne-Sophie. Our fourth presenter tonight, Claire Northway, is Associate Professor in the Department of English, where she teaches early English literature and conducts research on Shakespearean theater history. She wants to assure everyone that her talk today on the Book of Will contains no spoilers. Her presentation's titled, "That's What I Hate Most, the Thievery of It, Lost Perception and Heart in the Book of Will." One moment. All right. Okay. Okay, I think we're good to go there. Tonight's play, The Book of Will, is about Shakespeare in two ways. First, it is about his friends who were his fellow actors in the troupe called The King's Men, John Hemmings, Henry Condell, and Richard Burbage. After Shakespeare died in 1616, these actors gathered and edited his plays. Sorry. Okay. That's not working, Shirley.
It is so hard to make the hybrid format look
Sorry.
really seamless. We
Yes.
need to practice, I assure you. Okay, we'll just, we have to stop the share. And we'll start again. Sorry, everybody. Okay, let me try it again.
The one here, right?
It's not letting me put the presentation mode.
Resume the slideshow.
Okay, there we go. I'm just going to click out, sorry. Yay, there we go.
All right, I think we're good now. So his friends, right? John Hemmings, Henry Condell, and Richard Burbage, who you see here. After Shakespeare died, these actors gathered and edited his plays into an authoritative collection, thereby saving 18 previously unpublished Shakespeare plays from loss to the ravages of time. Therefore, a theme in the Book of Will, presented with great humor and heart, is that there's an ever-present powerful potential for loss, including death, thievery, lost love, lost faith, lost minds, but most of all, of course, lost art. Second, the Book of Will is about Shakespeare in that it is packed with quotations lifted from his plays. Some of the quotations are so famous that everyone knows them by heart, such as "to be or not to be," but some obscure jokes will be lost to all but Shakespeare specialists. Recognizing some of these quotations that you remember after having read a Shakespeare play is part of the pleasure of seeing Gunderson's The Book of Will. That's what you will love most about it, the thievery of it. While Michael's, Natalie's, and Anne-Sophie's talks covered the afterlife of specific plays and texts, I will mention Antony and Cleopatra. I want to take a few minutes to share with you the story of the afterlife of most English Renaissance plays. Whether plays survived or were lost seems hit or miss, but sometimes depended on early actors' attitudes towards loss. Placing a play in the hands of the King's Men was an especially risky gamble. My hope is that this brief historical consideration of why an artist's work may or may not survive will help you as audience goers both appreciate even more the significance of the remarkable and mostly true story of friendship depicted in the Book of Will, and revise your perception of how Shakespeare became a major author. So I want to start by offering a Shakespearean attitude towards loss that I think the King's Men shared. One of the plays that Shakespeare's friends saved was his tragedy, Antony and Cleopatra, which includes one of my favorite quotations. This one did not make the cut to be included in the Book of Will, and that's probably because it's just not very quotable. Then Antony, but now well on. This quotation is somewhat clearer in context. Shakespeare stages a character, Cleopatra, momentarily realizing the painful consequences
of losing someone important, her lover, Anthony, in battle. He goes forth gallantly that he and Caesar might determine this great war in single fight. Then Anthony, but now, well, on. This thought is at first so emotionally moving, such as the rapid fluctuation of thought that Michael talked about, that Cleopatra can't even articulate a full sentence. But within the same short line, Shakespeare also offers the necessary resolutions of loss that come from focusing on the present, the now, as well as from focusing on the possibility of survival through continuity, well on. This flexible attitude towards loss, voiced in this Anthony and Cleopatra line, could be seen as characterizing a pragmatic approach to loss embraced by the king's men, given that this acting company was rather prone to losing things. Then, as now, accidents can happen to anyone. Archival evidence shows that during the early modern period, whole plays were lost due to being eaten by mice or sinking in shipwrecks. The Book of Will imagines such mishaps, a drink spilling, a fire, which reminds us that plays were physical objects. But the Book of Will likewise accurately underscores the impact of human choice, errors, and taste preferences, which sometimes landed a playwright's plays in the trash. In fact, the king's men were sometimes outed as the main cause of plays being lost, accidentally or deliberately. For example, we learn in a 1597 legal case that a king's men actor lost a play, and 10 days later, an actor from a different troupe conveniently found it, staged it, and profited from the performance. In 1623 and 1625, the king's men begged censorship authorities to waive penalty fees for having lost the government-approved copies of The Winter's Tale and another play. Maybe these losses were innocent enough, but when their play, The Malcontent, was stolen, the king's men stole it back. Playwright Thomas Heywood suspected actors of mismanaging his plays. This playwright, who was just a few years younger than Shakespeare, authored 220 plays with either, in his words, an entire hand or at least a main finger. His complaint, made in the preface to his play, The English Traveler, implied that he would have liked to have had his own authoritative collection like Shakespeare, but was unable to. He blames the actors. True it is that my plays are not exposed unto the world in volumes to bear the title of works as others. One reason is that many of them have been negligently lost. Others of them are still retained in the hands of some actors who think it against their peculiar profit to have them come in print. Heywood's strong word, negligently, indicated reckless fault, and the king's men were not exempted here, as they had worked with Heywood on several plays. The king's men seemingly accepted some of these losses to their finances and their reputation with a shrug. Well, on. Thus, not all playwrights received the king's men's careful treatment of their dramas, or else perhaps the play we would be seeing tonight might be called The Book of Tom. Given this accident-prone and sometimes shady record of losing plays, the king's men's efforts to rally and save Shakespeare's plays in a collection is even more extraordinary. Strong friendship made the difference. In a letter at the beginning of their collection, we see the king's men's new attitude towards loss. Well, it is now public. We pray you do not envy his friends the office of their care and pain to have collected and published them. His wit can no more lie hid than it could be lost. In other words, then Shakespeare lived and his wit was almost lost, but now his plays are published. Well, read on in 1623 and on in 2023. The Book of Will stages a historically accurate, if partial, picture of the insecurity of plays survival, imagining that compelling relationships were highly motivating forces for the king's men and in our own lives as well. at least 744 professional plays from the time of Shakespeare have been lost, and likely hundreds more. All that's left today are 543 plays. For scholars, lost plays are something we accept, even if, like Cleopatra, it is almost too painful to put into words. We can take heart that not all actors were as careless as the king's men. The 1617 diary of actor Edward Allen, who was not in the King's Men, but whose acting company had also suffered thefts of plays, reveals that Allen was a bit fanatical about buying locks almost weekly to prevent thievery. Today, we are glad he did. 100 years after his death, the discovery of Allen's locked trunk, which contained the largest trove of theater history materials from Shakespeare's time, continues to offer the important keys to unlock how early Shakespearean theaters operated. Thank you.
Our final presenter of the evening is Don Hedrick. In addition to being a native Kansan and a faculty member at Penn State, he has also taught at UC Irvine, Cornell University, Amherst College, Colgate University, and Charles University in Prague. He researches Shakespeare in popular culture. His talk today is titled Little Books and Big, Size Mattering.
I'm going to do this without PowerPoint, old style, so I apologize in advance for the lack of technological thrills that I wish I could provide to you. Instead, I have some of these poster boards, so that's about as primitive as you can imagine, and I might pass one or two of those around, but those are probably good for you to look at during the break before the show or at the intermission of the show. This actually follows quite well along what Kara was talking about of lost plays. But more broadly, I'm talking about ephemera. But let me begin with a jest from the 16th century. I often assign jests to my students, and then I have to explain why they're funny because nobody can figure out why they're funny. So anyway, I'll give you one and you can decide yourself whether it's funny or not. Guy walks up to a bookseller in a bookstore. Okay, I know it sounds like a lot of joke. Guy walks up to it and says, you know, what do you got? The bookseller says, I have a book that you will keep forever close to your heart. I have a book that will keep forever. And the guy walking up says, I don't want a book that lasts forever. I want a book that goes away. Okay. The idea of plays as being ephemera was quite in place in the late 16th and early 17th century. So much so we have a famous story of Thomas Bodley of Oxford telling when he established the library there, telling his librarian not to put any plays there. Baggage books, he called them, or riffraff, he called them. So there was a sense in which plays were subliterary. And that's what I'm kind of tracing a little in a kind of a weird way from the three trajectory points, let's call them, of 1616, 1623, the date that we're all here for, and 1630, which in the history of the big book, which is what I'm looking at here, is a surprise that one would not necessarily anticipate. The printing, and again, I hope you get a chance to see these, but I think I'll go ahead and pass this one around because this would be good to look at before the show, because you can imagine the whole show taking place in some place like this, which was a printing arena for Shakespeare. So you can look at the compositors that put the type. You can look at the proofreaders, the inkers that have to stamp either too much or too little ink on the fonts. So you can take a look at those and pass those around. But again, might be good to keep that in mind as an imaginary setting for this play. So we've got the folio, and I do have a copy of the folio over here, facsimiles for people to wander through. I won't pass it around, but this you can feel like you can look at with its really lame picture of Shakespeare. Most people don't like this picture. It's probably not from life. There was a Spanish friar that was the model for that, a generic intellectual with a high forehead. Then the printers would printed the folio, folio meaning sheet in half, so the sheet of 13 by 18 inches or so would have been folded in half and printed on both sides. So there's four pages per each folio sheet. And then you take it to a binder in Shakespeare's time. So they didn't bind it. And these are the folios that are at the Shakespeare Library. We are, as everybody has pointed out, happy that the Bennington Condell saved the plays. They also saved versions of the plays. So you can look at this on your own, but it's the quarto version and the folio version of Hamlet. And if we didn't have the first folio version of Hamlet, Hamlet's to be or not to be would read to be or not to be. Hi, there's to die, to sleep. Is that all? So the lameness of it. Now this 1616 date for folio would be Ben Jonson's folio of Shakespeare's rival as a playwright. And we're looking at folios that actually show plays, which were at the time thought to be in this kind of way ephemeral as a subliterary genre. Okay, so plays that would go away or based on theatrical experience. Johnson's folio that he managed and supervised in 1616 is what I want to kind of look at here, because it presents literature as a kind of temple of knowledge. There are architectural parts of this that represent comedy and tragedy. So you're entering a kind of temple of the genre of historical literature when you enter this particular folio. Okay. Shakespeare's is really quite different, emphasizing choice so I hope everybody gets a chance to read Hennington Condell's To the Variety of Readers. It's really quite pleasant to read them saying, make sure if you understand, fine, but make sure you buy the book. And they said, and buy it and read it and read it again. But in 1616, then 7 years later than that, we have Shakespeare's folio, and then if we add 7 more years to the very next folio of literary works, we get a surprising turn in this kind of history of ephemera. And what you get is an author who produced, actually earlier produced a Bible in this form. This is about as small a book as you can imagine. Okay, maybe ephemera, maybe you could throw it away. Maybe it was cheap enough to throw away. And I'm going to follow the author of this book because it's very important sort of in the trajectory when we go from Ben Jonson and that classicist and museumified view of literature to Shakespeare's kind of radical change of that to what a choice of the consumer. You want tragedies, comedies, or histories. To the author of this book, who wrote all the books of the Bible in short doggerel poems. Okay, So Genesis, here's the book of Genesis. I'll pass this around to some of you probably not that popular. Jehovah, here of nothing, all things makes, and man, the chief of all, his God forsakes. Now, the surprise 1630 trajectory of the big book is by the same guy who did the Thumb Bible, which was very popular in England and carried over to the United States as well, these Thumb Bibles. And that guy is the equivalent of a taxi driver, okay, who ferried people across the Thames. So was he inspired by seeing authors begin to have things like the first folio of Shakespeare's, which was one of the motives, one of the things that was beginning to make an author, a playwright, into an author and producer. Okay, Shakespeare's plays before the late 1590s, 8 of them were published without his name as an author. The author function was not as prominent in this case. So does it take a folio to then create an author? Well, this taxi driver, John Taylor, celebrated himself as a poet, the water poet, okay, called himself, and in 1630 published his complete works in folio form. Okay, amazingly. He becomes the star of the production, just as Shakespeare was highlighted in the engraving of his face. And John Taylor is kind of fun too, because instead of the kind of classical architecture that was presented by Ben Jonson, a friend of his, he puts his working mode there of a rowboat across the Thames, okay, and put oars along the sides. So everything that's classicized and museumified takes on this other quality, and it's not exactly a joke, but the kind of things that he includes in his folio are what we would certainly think of as ephemera. He's one of the first persons to write nonsense verse. We don't have time. Just about, okay, I'll just finish with this. The first volume of nonsense verse, one of the first volumes of nonsense verse in England. He writes poems about the woman who does his laundry, in praise of laundry. A funeral elegy for King James. So there's a mixture of high seriousness that would usually belong to a folio presentation. Taylor's Penniless Pilgrimage, some of the earliest travel literature is here, where he went across England with no money and records how that worked out. Actually worked out pretty well for him. In other countries that he visited, Taylor's Goose, there's a chapter on all the words that he could think of that end in ship, like fellowship. Why? It's about as explicable as finding a deep meaning in one of the jest books that I looked at. But here we have something where literature is now becoming something more like a plaything, as ephemeral as it was appeared to be before Shakespeare and others made it lasting.
Thank you, Don. So that concludes our Shakespeare After Shakespeare talks. If you're in the in-person audience, I encourage you to stick around for just a few more minutes because we are going to be doing a prize drawing for Andrea May's The Millionaire and the Bard, for which we have slips out. So I'm going to be picking the winner from that. I want to say goodbye to you in Zoom world. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great night.